My parents gave my sister, Elena, everything. Harvard law tuition, summer internships, their endless support and pride. They told me I was too practical for law school and should find something more realistic. But when Elena stood before that federal judge facing criminal charges, and he looked past her to ask, "Is Justice Rebecca Chen still on the Supreme Court?" the courtroom went silent. Because their forgotten daughter wasn't just watching from the gallery, I was the one who would decide her fate. My parents gave my sister Elena everything. Harvard law tuition, summer internships, their endless support and pride. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed. Because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. They told me I was too practical for law school and should find something more realistic. But when Elena stood before that federal judge facing criminal charges, and he looked past her to ask, "Is Justice Rebecca Chen still on the Supreme Court?" the courtroom went silent. Because their forgotten daughter wasn't just watching from the gallery, I was the one who would decide her fate. Growing up in Palo Alto, California, our house was a monument to Elena's destined greatness. The study walls were lined with her debate team trophies, mock trial certificates, and newspaper clippings from every academic competition she'd dominated. Her acceptance letter to Harvard Law School was framed in gold and hung above the fireplace like a family crest. Elena was born to be a lawyer, everyone said. She had the charisma, the quick wit, the commanding presence that could sway any jury. My achievements were relegated to the basement family room. A small plaque for my high school's Model UN team sat behind a dusty plant. My perfect SAT scores were mentioned only when Elena's friends' parents asked about test prep tutors. My acceptance to Stanford, was acknowledged with a polite, "That's nice, dear," while Elena's Harvard admission spawned a month-long celebration. The family narrative was crystal clear. Elena was the brilliant future attorney, and I was the reliable backup plan. "Rebecca's so steady," Mom would tell visitors, using the same tone she'd reserved for describing a dependable appliance. "She'll find her niche somewhere. Elena's the one with the legal mind." Every family gathering reinforced this hierarchy. Uncle David, a partner at a prestigious San Francisco firm, would spend hours discussing case law with Elena, while I sat ignored at the dinner table. Aunt Margaret would ask Elena detailed questions about her summer internship at the DA's office, while treating my part-time job at a veterans advocacy center like a hobby I'd eventually outgrow. Elena thrived in the spotlight our parents created for her. She spoke at high school graduation as valedictorian. She interned with federal judges during college. She landed a coveted position at the Harvard Law Review before her second year. Every achievement was celebrated with family dinners, social media posts, and calls to relatives who'd hear about Elena's latest triumph. Meanwhile, I was the practical daughter. When I expressed interest in law school, Dad patted my shoulder and suggested I consider paralegal certification instead. "Law school's expensive, sweetheart, and Elena's already got the family's legal career covered. Maybe think about something more attainable." When Elena needed help with her law school applications, the family hired a professional consultant. When I applied for my undergraduate political science program, I was handed a stack of application forms and told to figure it out. Elena's LSAT prep course cost $3,000. My LSAT prep book came from the public library. The physical space of our home told the story perfectly. Elena's bedroom remained a shrine throughout law school. Her debate trophies dusted weekly. Her Harvard acceptance letter spotlighted with strategic lighting. Her law school graduation photo prominently displayed on her nightstand. My room was converted into Mom's yoga studio before I'd even finished my sophomore year at Stanford. Even our childhood friends understood the family hierarchy. When Elena came home from Harvard, neighborhood parents would invite her to career day presentations and mock trial demonstrations. When I came home from Stanford, I was asked to babysit their younger children and help with yard work. The message was consistent and clear. Elena was the Chen family's investment in the future, the daughter whose success would reflect their good parenting and wise guidance. I was the daughter who would hopefully find something suitable to occupy her time while Elena built the prestigious legal career that would make them proud. In Palo Alto, where achievement was currency and prestige was everything, there was Elena Chen, the future Supreme Court justice, and then there was Rebecca, the other daughter who would hopefully figure something out eventually. The double standard became painfully obvious during our college years. When Elena needed help with her Harvard Law tuition, $60,000 per year, Dad took out a second mortgage without hesitation. "Investment in our family's future," he declared proudly at the bank signing. When I needed help with Stanford's significantly lower tuition, I was handed a stack of financial aid applications and told to explore scholarship opportunities. Elena's summer internship at the San Francisco District Attorney's Office was unpaid, so our parents covered her living expenses, bought her professional wardrobe, and even paid for parking in downtown San Francisco. When I landed a paid internship at a veterans legal clinic, actually earning money while gaining experience, Mom's response was, "That's nice, dear, but it's not really prestigious like Elena's position." The law school application process revealed the true depths of favoritism. Elena's applications were a family project. Dad hired a consultant who specialized in Ivy League admissions. Mom organized study groups for her LSAT prep. They even paid for Elena to fly to Cambridge for an informal Harvard Law interview with an alumni connection. The entire family treated Elena's law school journey like a military campaign requiring total resource commitment. When I quietly applied to law schools myself, using money saved from my part-time jobs, the reaction was dismissive at best. "Rebecca, sweetheart," Mom said with that patronizing smile, "law school is extremely competitive. Elena barely got into Harvard with all her advantages. Maybe you should focus on something more realistic." Dad was even more direct. "One lawyer in the family is enough," he said while reviewing Elena's first-year grades. "Besides, you don't have Elena's natural argumentative skills. Have you considered teaching? Or maybe social work?" The financial support disparity was staggering. Elena's law school graduation party cost $8,000, a catered affair in our backyard with a jazz quartet and engraved invitations. My Stanford graduation was acknowledged with dinner at Olive Garden, and a congratulatory card bought from the pharmacy on the way to the restaurant. When Elena struggled with her first-year constitutional law course, our parents hired a private tutor, a retired federal judge who charged $200 per hour. When I struggled with organic chemistry during my pre-law requirements, I was told to buckle down and figure it out. The family's social media presence told the story perfectly. Elena's Harvard Law graduation generated 47 Facebook posts from various family members, including a professional photo shoot Mom had arranged. My Stanford graduation merited a single blurry cell phone picture with the caption, "Rebecca graduated too." Career advice followed the same pattern. Elena's job search involved family connections, networking events, and strategic introductions to partners at prestigious firms. Uncle David personally recommended her for positions at 3 different white-shoe law firms in San Francisco. When I mentioned my interest in public service law, the response was lukewarm at best. "Public interest law doesn't pay well," Dad pointed out, as if my financial security was somehow less important than Elena's career prestige. "Elena's going to make partner at a major firm. She'll be able to support herself properly." The assumptions about our capabilities were equally telling. When Elena received a job offer from a mid-tier corporate firm, the family celebration lasted for weeks. When I was accepted to serve as a judicial clerk for a federal appeals court judge, a position most law students could only dream of, the response was polite indifference. "That's nice," Mom said, not looking up from Elena's latest legal brief that she was helping proofread. "I'm sure it will be good experience for whatever you end up doing." Even our romantic relationships were subject to different standards. Elena's boyfriend Marcus, a fellow Harvard Law student, was welcomed into the family like a conquering hero. My boyfriend David, an Army veteran attending law school on the GI Bill, was treated with polite tolerance and barely concealed skepticism about his unconventional background. The breaking point came during Elena's law school graduation dinner. The entire extended family had gathered at the Ritz-Carlton in San Francisco to celebrate her achievement and her job offer from Morrison, Wells & Associates, a prestigious corporate firm where she'd be making $180,000 as a first-year associate. The private dining room was decorated with congratulatory flowers, and Uncle David had prepared a toast that went on for 10 minutes about Elena's brilliant legal mind. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. I sat at the far end of the table, picking at my salmon and listening to the familiar chorus of praise for my sister's accomplishments. Then Cousin Jennifer, fresh from her own law school graduation, turned to me with that mixture of curiosity and pity I'd grown to recognize. "So, Rebecca, what are your plans now that Elena's conquered the legal world?" she asked with a laugh that had an edge to it. "Still thinking about law school? Or have you finally accepted that some families only need one lawyer?" The table quieted momentarily, and I felt every eye turn toward me with mild interest. The same attention you'd give to a mildly amusing sideshow. Dad chuckled and raised his wine glass toward Elena. "Well, Rebecca's always been more of a behind-the-scenes type. Elena got all the courtroom charisma in this family." Mom nodded approvingly. "Rebecca's found her niche in that veterans advocacy work. It's perfect for her, helping people, very fulfilling, not too demanding." That's when something fundamental shifted inside me. Not anger, something deeper than that. A cold, crystalline clarity that cut through years of accepting their narrative about my limitations. I had spent 4 years at Stanford earning a 3.9 GPA in political science while working 20 hours a week at the Veterans Legal Clinic. I had written papers on constitutional law that my professors had recommended for publication. I had scored in the 99th percentile on the LSAT, higher than Elena, though I'd never mentioned it to anyone. I had been accepted to 7 law schools, including Yale, though I'd hidden those acceptance letters in my desk drawer rather than face another round of "that's nice, dear" responses. But most importantly, I had discovered something at the Veterans Clinic that Elena would never find in her corporate law firm: a passion for justice that went beyond prestige and salary. I had seen how the legal system failed the people who had served our country, and I had found my calling in fighting for those who couldn't fight for themselves. That night, lying in my childhood bed that had been pushed into the corner to make room for Mom's exercise equipment, I made a decision that would change everything. I wouldn't try to compete with Elena for their approval anymore. I wouldn't explain my achievements or defend my choices. Instead, I would build something so significant that their understanding wouldn't matter. I opened my laptop and accepted my offer to attend Yale Law School. Not just any law school, but the institution that had produced more Supreme Court justices than any other. The full scholarship I'd been offered would cover everything, meaning I wouldn't need their financial support or approval. More importantly, I began researching a path that Elena, with all her corporate law ambitions, had never considered: federal clerkships, appellate litigation, constitutional law specialization, and eventually, the federal judiciary. While Elena was planning to make partner at a corporate firm, I was quietly mapping a route to the highest court in the land. I didn't call home to announce my Yale acceptance. I didn't share my LSAT score or my scholarship offer. Instead, I simply began building a legal career that would eventually intersect with Elena's world in ways none of us could have imagined. The family had chosen their star. Now I would become something they had never thought to choose. Someone whose authority would eventually extend beyond their wildest comprehension. While Elena was attending corporate law firm mixers and building her network of future rainmakers, I was quietly constructing a legal career that operated in an entirely different stratosphere. Yale Law School wasn't just an education. It was a launching pad into the highest echelons of American jurisprudence, and I threw myself into it with the intensity of someone who had something to prove to herself, if no one else. My days began at 5 a.m. in the law library, studying constitutional precedents and appellate procedure with a focus that bordered on obsessive. While other students socialized and networked, I spent every free moment either in the stacks, researching, or working as a research assistant for Professor Elizabeth Hartwell, a former Supreme Court clerk whose recommendation could open doors most lawyers never even knew existed. The work was relentless. Constitutional law seminars that dissected every Supreme Court decision from the past century. Federal courts workshops where we analyzed appellate strategy with sitting federal judges. Advanced constitutional theory courses that required reading hundreds of pages of jurisprudence each night. But unlike Elena's corporate law focus on billable hours and client development, my specialization was building something more fundamental: expertise in the constitutional principles that govern our entire legal system. My professors began to notice. Professor Hartwell recommended me for the Yale Law Journal, where I wrote extensively on veterans' rights and constitutional due process, combining my passion for justice with academic rigor that would eventually influence federal policy. My seminar papers on equal protection and constitutional interpretation were being cited by federal appeals courts before I'd even graduated. But the real breakthrough came through my summer internships, which followed a trajectory Elena couldn't have imagined. While she was working at corporate firms learning contract negotiation and securities law, I was clerking for federal appeals court judges, learning how the law actually functioned at its highest levels. My first summer, I clerked for Judge Patricia Morrison of the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals, a position typically reserved for students who plan to clerk for the Supreme Court after graduation. The work was intellectually demanding in ways that corporate law never could be. I spent 12-hour days researching constitutional questions that would affect millions of Americans, drafting judicial opinions that would set precedent for decades, and observing oral arguments in cases that shaped federal law. Judge Morrison became my mentor in ways my family never understood. She taught me not just legal analysis but judicial temperament, how to balance competing constitutional principles, how to write opinions that would withstand scrutiny, how to think not just like a lawyer but like a judge. When she recommended me for a Supreme Court clerkship during my final year at Yale, she told me something I'll never forget. "Rebecca, you don't think like someone who wants to practice law. You think like someone who wants to shape it." The Supreme Court clerkship application process was grueling beyond anything Elena had experienced in her corporate job search. Multiple rounds of interviews with different justices, writing samples that were scrutinized by the finest legal minds in the country, recommendations from federal judges who knew my work intimately. When Justice William Brenner's office called to offer me a position, I was sitting in my small New Haven apartment, surrounded by constitutional law treatises and case briefs that represented 3 years of 18-hour days. But I didn't call home to share the news. My family was too busy celebrating Elena's promotion to senior associate to understand that their practical daughter had just been selected for the most prestigious position in American legal education, a clerkship that would give me direct access to the constitutional decision-making process at the highest level. While Elena was learning how to maximize billable hours for pharmaceutical companies, I was learning how constitutional law actually gets made, one case at a time in the marble halls of the Supreme Court building. By my 10th year after law school, I had achieved something that would have been incomprehensible to my family back in Palo Alto. I was Justice Rebecca Chen of the United States Supreme Court, the youngest person appointed to the court in over a century, and only the 5th woman in American history to hold the position. The ceremony where I was sworn in had been attended by the President, the Chief Justice, and every major legal figure in the country. My family wasn't there. They didn't even know it had happened. The path to the Supreme Court had been methodical and unrelenting. After my clerkship with Justice Brenner, I had joined the Department of Justice's Office of the Solicitor General, the elite unit that argues the government's position before the Supreme Court. For 5 years, I argued cases before the very court I would eventually join, building a reputation for constitutional expertise that extended far beyond what Elena's corporate practice could ever achieve. My arguments before the court had shaped federal law in ways that affected millions of Americans. Veterans' rights cases that established new precedents for due process. Constitutional challenges that defined the scope of federal power. Civil rights litigation that expanded protections for marginalized communities. The legal briefs I wrote were studied in law schools across the country, and my oral arguments were considered masterclasses in appellate advocacy. The President's selection of me for the Supreme Court had surprised political observers, not because of my qualifications, which were unassailable, but because of my relative youth and my background in veterans advocacy. At 35, I was younger than Elena, who was still grinding toward partnership at Morrison Wells and Associates, still billing hours on pharmaceutical patent disputes and corporate mergers. The confirmation hearings had been grueling but triumphant. Senators from both parties had praised my judicial temperament, my constitutional expertise, and my commitment to the rule of law. The American Bar Association had given me their highest rating. Law professors from Harvard, Yale, and Stanford had testified about my intellectual rigor and legal scholarship. The veterans organizations I had represented pro bono had sent delegations to support my nomination. But perhaps the most surreal aspect of my position was the scope of authority it granted me. Every major constitutional question in America would eventually come before my court. Every federal law, every constitutional challenge, every case that shaped American jurisprudence would require my input and decision. Elena's corporate clients might pay her firm millions in legal fees, but the cases I decided affected the fundamental rights of every American citizen. My chambers in the Supreme Court building overlooked the Capitol, where the laws I would interpret were written. My law clerks were the most brilliant legal minds from the top law schools in the country, students who competed fiercely for the honor of working for a Supreme Court justice. My written opinions would be studied for decades, cited in legal briefs for generations, and taught in constitutional law courses long after Elena's corporate contracts were forgotten. The security detail that accompanied me everywhere was a constant reminder of the weight of my position. Death threats from extremists who disagreed with my constitutional interpretations. Protection protocols that required advance notice for any public appearance. A level of public scrutiny that made Elena's partnership announcement in the local legal journal seem quaint by comparison. Yet through all of this, the confirmation hearings, the swearing-in ceremony, the media coverage that described me as a constitutional scholar and brilliant legal mind, I had maintained the same humble silence that had characterized my entire career. My family still thought of me as the practical daughter who had found her niche in veterans advocacy work, unaware that their quiet Rebecca was now one of the 9 most powerful legal authorities in the United States. The call came on a Tuesday afternoon while I was reviewing oral argument transcripts for a landmark civil rights case. My secretary's voice carried an unusual tension as she announced, "Justice Chen, you have an urgent call from Elena Chen. She says she's your sister, and it's a family emergency." I hadn't spoken to Elena in over 2 years, not since our last awkward family dinner, where she dominated the conversation with stories about her latest corporate merger, while I listened politely and said nothing about the constitutional cases that were reshaping American law. The family still thought I was working in veterans advocacy, a comfortable fiction I'd never bothered to correct. "Rebecca?" Elena's voice was strained, desperate in a way I'd never heard before. "Thank God I tracked you down. I'm in serious trouble, and I need your help. I need someone who understands the legal system." She explained through tears that she was facing federal criminal charges. Her law firm, Morrison, Wells & Associates, had been under FBI investigation for money laundering, and Elena had been indicted as part of a conspiracy to hide pharmaceutical company assets in offshore accounts. The charges included wire fraud, conspiracy, and violation of federal banking regulations, crimes that carried potential sentences of 20 years in federal prison. "The arraignment is next week in the Northern District of California," Elena continued, her professional composure completely shattered. "Rebecca, I know you work with legal issues, right? With veterans? Do you know anyone in federal criminal law, anyone who might understand how these cases work?" The irony was so perfect it almost took my breath away. Elena was calling me the family disappointment who had supposedly found a modest niche in veterans advocacy, asking for help with a federal criminal case that would ultimately be reviewable by the very court where I sat as a justice. "I'm looking at real prison time," she whispered. "My career is over. Everything Mom and Dad invested in me, everything I worked for, it's all gone." The firm threw me under the bus, claiming I was the mastermind when I was just following orders from the partners. I listened to my sister, the golden child, the Harvard law graduate, the one whose success had overshadowed mine for our entire lives, essentially begging me for assistance with a legal system she thought she understood but had clearly misjudged. Her corporate law experience had prepared her for boardroom negotiations and securities compliance, not federal criminal defense. "The prosecutor is some hotshot from the Justice Department," Elena continued, "and the judge assigned to my case is Judge Harrison from the Northern District. I heard he's tough on white-collar crime. Rebecca, I'm scared. I don't know how to navigate federal criminal procedure. This isn't like the civil litigation I'm used to." What Elena didn't know, couldn't know, was that Judge Harrison was a former colleague from my days at the Justice Department. We had worked together on several constitutional cases, and he had been at my confirmation hearings, praising my legal scholarship and judicial temperament. More importantly, any conviction in his court would be appealable directly to the Ninth Circuit, and potentially to my court if constitutional issues were involved. "Elena," I said carefully, "I want to help you. Let me see what I can do." "Really?" The relief in her voice was palpable. "You'd do that for me? Even after? I mean, I know the family hasn't always treated your work as seriously as we should have." "Family is family," I replied, already knowing that I would be attending her arraignment, not as the supportive sister she expected, but as someone whose authority in that courtroom would be absolute and undeniable. The stage was set for a revelation that would reshape everything our family had ever believed about success, failure, and the true meaning of achievement. The federal courthouse in San Francisco was buzzing with activity the morning of Elena's arraignment. I arrived early, dressed in a simple navy suit that gave no indication of my actual position, and took a seat in the public gallery where I could observe without being noticed. Elena sat at the defendant's table with her criminal defense attorney, her usually confident demeanor replaced by visible anxiety, as she shuffled through legal documents she clearly didn't fully understand. Our parents had driven up from Palo Alto, sitting in the front row behind Elena, with the shell-shocked expressions of people whose carefully constructed reality had just imploded. Mom kept dabbing at her eyes with tissues, while Dad stared straight ahead with the grim resignation of someone watching his family's reputation disintegrate in real time. Judge Harrison entered the courtroom with the measured dignity that characterized federal proceedings. I had known him for over a decade, first as a colleague in the Justice Department and later as a respected member of the federal judiciary. He was thorough, fair, and absolutely uncompromising when it came to legal procedure and constitutional requirements. The arraignment proceeded with standard federal court protocol. Elena stood as the charges were read: conspiracy to commit wire fraud, money laundering, and violation of federal banking regulations. Her attorney entered a plea of not guilty, and the discussion turned to bail conditions and pretrial motions. Elena's voice was barely audible as she answered the judge's questions about her employment, residence, and travel restrictions. Then something unexpected happened. As Judge Harrison was reviewing the case file, he paused and looked up at the gallery, his eyes scanning the seated observers with the careful attention that comes from years of judicial experience. His gaze stopped when it reached me, and I saw the moment of recognition cross his features. "I'm sorry," Judge Harrison said, addressing the courtroom but looking directly at me. "Before we proceed further, I need to acknowledge a distinguished visitor in our courtroom today." The entire courtroom fell silent. Elena turned around, following the judge's gaze with confusion written across her face. Our parents looked back as well, trying to understand why a federal judge would be addressing someone in the public gallery during their daughter's criminal proceeding. Judge Harrison continued, his voice carrying the formal respect reserved for the highest levels of the judiciary. "Justice Rebecca Chen of the United States Supreme Court is present in our courtroom today. Justice Chen, would you mind if I acknowledged your presence officially?" The words hit the courtroom like a physical blow. Elena's mouth fell open, her legal documents slipping from her hands and scattering across the defendant's table. Mom gasped audibly, her tissue falling to the floor forgotten. Dad turned around so quickly he nearly fell out of his seat, his eyes wide with disbelief. I stood slowly, nodding respectfully to Judge Harrison. "Thank you, Your Honor. I'm here in a personal capacity." "Of course," Judge Harrison replied, his tone carrying both professional courtesy and genuine warmth. "Ladies and gentlemen, Justice Chen serves on the highest court in our land and has been instrumental in shaping constitutional law for the past several years. It's an honor to have her in our courtroom." Elena was staring at me like I was a stranger, her face cycling through shock, confusion, and dawning realization. The sister she had called asking for help with someone who might understand the federal legal system was sitting in the gallery as one of the 9 most powerful judicial authorities in the United States. The golden child who had always been destined for legal greatness was facing federal criminal charges while her forgotten sister held a lifetime appointment to the Supreme Court, The courtroom remained frozen in stunned silence as the full magnitude of the revelation settled over everyone present. Elena's defense attorney, a seasoned federal criminal lawyer, looked like he was trying to process how his client's sister, the one she'd described as working in veterans advocacy, was actually a sitting Supreme Court justice. Judge Harrison, maintaining professional decorum despite the extraordinary circumstances, addressed the court clerk. Please note for the record that Justice Rebecca Chen of the United States Supreme Court is present as an observer in today's proceedings. The court reporter's fingers moved mechanically across her stenotype machine, officially documenting that one of the 9 most powerful legal authorities in America was watching her sister's criminal arraignment. Elena turned around again, staring at me with an expression that combined disbelief with the growing realization that everything she thought she knew about our family hierarchy had just been obliterated. Your Honor, Elena's attorney said hesitantly, may I request a brief recess to consult with my client? Judge Harrison nodded. Court will recess for 15 minutes. As the courtroom began to buzz with whispered conversations, I made my way toward the front where my family sat in various states of shock. Mom's hands were trembling as she fumbled with her purse, while Dad stared at me like I was someone he'd never seen before. Rebecca? Mom's voice was barely a whisper. You're on the Supreme Court? The Supreme Court? Elena approached slowly, her criminal defense attorney trailing behind her with an expression of professional bewilderment. Rebecca, I don't understand. When I called you for help, you're actually… I'm a justice on the United States Supreme Court, I said simply, my voice carrying the same calm tone I'd used throughout my confirmation hearings. I have been for the past 3 years. Dad found his voice first. 3 years? You've been on the Supreme Court for 3 years, and you never told us? You never asked about my work, I replied gently. When I tried to share my achievements, you were always focused on Elena's career. I stopped trying to get your attention and started focusing on my work instead. Elena's attorney stepped forward, his professional instincts overriding his personal shock. Justice Chen, I want to assure you that your presence here creates no ethical conflicts. You've had no involvement in this case, and any potential appeals would involve standard recusal protocols. I appreciate your thoroughness, counselor, I replied. I'm here purely in a personal capacity, and I would naturally recuse myself from any matter involving my family that might come before the court. The bailiff announced that court would resume in 5 minutes, but Elena wasn't moving toward the defendant's table. She stood frozen, staring at the judicial bench where Judge Harrison was reviewing case files, then back at me. The law schools, she said slowly, pieces clicking into place. Yale Law School. You went to Yale, didn't you? And those summer internships you never talked about. Federal Appeals Court clerkships, I confirmed. Then the Supreme Court clerkship, then the Solicitor General's office, then my judicial appointment. Mom sank back into her seat, her face pale. We missed everything. Your confirmation hearings, your swearing-in ceremony. You missed it because you never knew to look for it, I said without bitterness. You were watching Elena's corporate law career while I was building something you didn't recognize. As we returned to our seats for the continuation of the hearing, the entire dynamic of the courtroom had shifted. Elena was no longer just another defendant facing federal charges. She was the sister of a Supreme Court justice, a relationship that would be noted in every news report and legal filing related to her case. The golden child was facing potential prison time while her forgotten sister possessed the kind of legal authority that existed at the very pinnacle of American jurisprudence. After the arraignment concluded, Elena and I found ourselves alone in a small conference room while our parents waited in the courthouse lobby, still processing the revelation that had turned their understanding of our family upside down. Elena sat across from me, her expensive lawyer's briefcase open but ignored, her hands folded in her lap like a chastened child. Rebecca, she began, her voice small and vulnerable in a way I hadn't heard since we were children. I called you for help because I thought you might know someone in the legal system. I had no idea. I never imagined that you were… that I was successful? I asked gently, without any trace of smugness or vindication. She nodded, tears beginning to form in her eyes. I feel like such a fool. All those years of thinking I was the one destined for greatness while you were just finding your place somewhere in the background. And here you are, sitting on the highest court in the country, and I'm facing federal prison. I could have savored this moment. could have reminded her of every dismissive comment, every assumption about my limitations, every time she'd been celebrated while I was overlooked. The power dynamic had shifted so completely that I could have made her feel as small as I'd felt during all those family dinners where my achievements were brushed aside. Instead, I chose a different path. Elena, do you remember when we were kids and you helped me with that Model UN presentation on international law? I asked. You spent hours helping me understand the arguments, even though it wasn't your assignment. She looked up, surprised by the gentle direction of the conversation. That's who you really are, I continued. Not the corporate lawyer who got caught up in a scheme you didn't fully understand, but the sister who cared about justice and wanted to help people. That person is still there, Elena. I leaned forward, my voice taking on the same compassionate tone I used when mentoring law clerks who were struggling with difficult cases. This criminal case doesn't define you any more than our family's expectations define me. You made mistakes, but that doesn't erase the good lawyer you can still become. Elena wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. But Rebecca, my career is over. Even if I avoid prison, no law firm will ever hire me. My reputation, everything I worked for. Your reputation in corporate law might be damaged, I agreed. But there are other kinds of legal work that need passionate advocates. Public defenders' offices, legal aid societies, veterans advocacy groups, places where your Harvard training could actually make a difference in people's lives rather than just maximizing pharmaceutical company profits. She stared at me with growing understanding. You're talking about redemption. I'm talking about finding your real purpose, I replied. You called me for help because you trust me, Elena. That trust goes both ways. I believe you can come through this and become the kind of lawyer who serves justice instead of just serving clients who can afford premium billing rates. I pulled out a business card and slid it across the table. This is the contact information for Sarah Martinez, the director of the Federal Public Defender's Office here in Northern District. When your case is resolved, call her. Tell her I recommended you for their Veterans Rights Division. Elena picked up the card with trembling fingers. You'd do that for me? After everything, after how the family treated you, after I never even knew. Elena, our parents' failure to recognize my success doesn't diminish what you could accomplish if you redirect your talents towards something meaningful. This case might be the best thing that ever happened to your legal career, if you let it teach you what really matters. The conference room that had witnessed the most shocking family revelation in our history became the place where two sisters finally found their way toward understanding each other as adults, rather than competing children. 18 months later, I stood in the Supreme Court building's main corridor, but this time Elena was with me, not as a criminal defendant, but as my guest for the court's annual Constitution Day celebration. She wore a simple black suit, her Federal Public Defender's Office badge visible on her lapel, a symbol of the remarkable transformation she'd undergone since that shocking day in Judge Harrison's courtroom. Elena's case had concluded with a plea agreement that resulted in 2 years of probation and community service, along with mandatory restitution to the fraud victims. But more importantly, it had catalyzed a complete reevaluation of her legal career and personal values. True to my recommendation, she had contacted Sarah Martinez at the Federal Public Defender's Office, and after completing her probation requirements, had been hired to head their new Veterans Justice Initiative. The work suited her in ways corporate law never had. Her Harvard training, which had once been devoted to protecting pharmaceutical company assets, now served veterans who couldn't afford legal representation. Her analytical skills, previously used to find loopholes in securities regulations, were now applied to ensuring that former service members received the benefits and protection they'd earned. The competitive drive that had once focused on billable hours was now channeled into fighting for clients who had nowhere else to turn. Our parents had undergone their own transformation. The revelation that their practical daughter sat on the Supreme Court while their destined-for-greatness daughter faced federal charges had shattered their understanding of success so completely that they'd been forced to rebuild their worldview from scratch. Mom had quietly removed Elena's Harvard Law diploma from the place of honor above the fireplace, replacing it with a photo of both of us at my Supreme Court confirmation ceremony, an event they had missed, but now studied obsessively through online videos. Dad had started reading my Supreme Court opinions, struggling through constitutional law concepts he'd never bothered to understand when I was studying them. His comments about my work had evolved from dismissive to genuinely curious, and he'd begun asking thoughtful questions about constitutional interpretation and judicial philosophy. The man who had once suggested I consider paralegal certification was now telling neighbors that his daughter was shaping American law at the highest level. The most profound change, however, was in how Elena and I related to each other. The competitive dynamic that had characterized our childhood had been replaced by genuine collaboration. When she encountered complex constitutional issues in her public defender work, she would call me for guidance, not because she needed help from a more successful sister, but because she respected my expertise and wanted to serve her clients better. When I was drafting opinions that affected veterans' rights, I would consult with her about the practical implications for the people she represented. The family dinners that had once been exhibitions of Elena's achievements while I sat ignored had become genuine conversations about law, justice, and public service. Our parents would listen as we discussed constitutional principles and criminal justice reform, finally understanding that both of their daughters were working toward the same goal through different paths. The shrine mentality had been replaced by something healthier: pride in both of our contributions to the legal system and society. Uncle David, who had once dismissed my career choices while celebrating Elena's corporate law trajectory, now regularly consulted both of us on pro bono cases his firm handled. Cousin Jennifer, who had once asked when I was going to accept that some families only need one lawyer, now brought her law school friends to family gatherings specifically to meet the Supreme Court justice they'd read about in constitutional law casebooks. But perhaps the most meaningful transformation was in Elena's relationship with her work. The passionate advocate who had once been buried under billable hour requirements and corporate profit motives had finally found her voice in fighting for justice, rather than just fighting for clients who could afford premium legal services. Her veterans advocacy work had garnered national attention, and she'd been invited to speak at law schools about the importance of public service legal careers. During the Constitution Day reception, Elena approached me with a newspaper clipping, a feature article about her Veterans Justice Initiative that described her as a passionate advocate who left corporate law to fight for those who served our country. The article made no mention of her criminal case or her famous sister, focusing instead on the impact her work was having on veterans who had been failed by the legal system. "Rebecca," she said, her voice filled with a satisfaction I'd never heard during her corporate law days, "I wanted to thank you, not just for helping me through the worst time of my life, but for showing me what legal work could actually accomplish when it's focused on justice instead of profit." I smiled, thinking about how our roles had evolved from competitors to collaborators. "Elena, you found your own path to meaningful work. I just helped you see that there were more options than the ones our family had mapped out for us. The truth I want every woman watching this to understand is that your worth isn't determined by other people's ability to envision your potential. Your success isn't limited by their capacity to understand your chosen path. Sometimes the people who love us most are the least equipped to recognize our capabilities, especially when we're developing skills and pursuing goals that exist outside their frame of reference." I spent years building my career in silence, not because I was ashamed of my achievements, but because I learned that some validation has to come from within. That's not a tragedy, it's liberation. When you stop waiting for others to recognize your worth, you free yourself to build something extraordinary, without the weight of their expectations or limitations. To every woman who has been told she's not ambitious enough, who has been assigned supporting roles while others take center stage, who has been dismissed as the practical one while someone else is celebrated as the visionary, your moment will come. But don't wait for permission to claim it. Don't wait for recognition to start building it. Don't wait for understanding to start achieving it. Build your expertise in the quiet moments. Develop your skills when no one is watching. Create your opportunities when everyone assumes you're just getting by. And when the time comes for revelation, and it will come, let your work speak louder than their assumptions ever could. Success isn't about proving other people wrong about you. It's about proving yourself right. And sometimes, the greatest victory isn't changing their perception of your worth. It's reaching the point where their perception becomes irrelevant to your sense of purpose and achievement. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.